The purpose of the lawfully processed assessment is to determine if you have an adequate lawful basis upon which you can process the personal data. In many cases, this can be simple to determine, but you may find that the lawful basis is unclear or there are multiple. You should consult with your DPO if you are uncertain, or consider adding a further similar activity if you think that more than one lawful basis might apply. For example, you may process employee data as part of a contractual obligation whilst the employee is in contract. However, when the employee leaves, you may determine that the lawful basis changes to legal obligation. You might find it clearer to document this as two separate activities. If your activity involves processing sensitive personal data, you will also need to select a secondary lawful basis to justify why you are able to process this sensitive personal data. You can rely upon consent as your lawful basis if you have explicit consent of the data subject. This must be specific enough to include this type of processing activity. If you are relying on consent, then you must be able to provide evidence that each data subject has consented and where this evidence is located. You can rely on contractual obligation if you have a contract or are working towards a contract to which the data subject is party, such as an employment contract or a contract to provide goods and services. You could also rely upon legal obligation, where the processing is necessary in order to remain compliant with a legal obligation to which the data controller is subject. For example, financial institutions may seek to verify a data subject's identity to comply with anti-money laundering regulation. You can rely upon vital interest when the processing is required to protect the vital interests of either the data subject or another person. For example, in preserving the life of an individual. You can rely on public interest where the activity is required for tasks carried out in the public interest, such as preserving law and order. This may also be used if the data controller requires the activity as part of the official authority invested in it. You can rely on legitimate interest only when your interest as an organization are not overwritten by the interests of the rights of the data subject. It is therefore important that you can evidence that you've assessed each activity which relies on legitimate interest. Even if you can select an adequate lawful basis, there may be circumstances where you've had some concerns about the process. You can enter these here, and the activity will automatically be added to the data protection risk log. If you select legitimate interests as the lawful basis, the expanding side menu will automatically change to include a legitimate interests assessment option. You will not be able to start the legitimate interests assessment until you have saved the lawfully processed assessment. A legitimate interest assessment is required to determine how necessary the processing is and to balance your organization's needs with the needs, rights, and expectations of the data subject. You will then be required to complete a number of questions which will be dynamically presented to you depending on the information that you enter. Answering these questions will provide a guide as to the legitimacy of the activity once complete. You should always consider the views of the data subject and ensure that these are reflected in your responses. Once the legitimate interest assessment is complete, ProvePrivacy will provide a status for the assessment, which will either be a pass, refer, or fail. When ProvePrivacy determines that the assessment is a fail, it is unlikely that you should continue with the activity, and therefore, this will be added to the risk log. When it is determined as a refer, it will be referred for a further decision. This should be discussed with your line manager to establish the next steps. When the assessment passes, the activity can continue with legitimate interests as the lawful basis. You may choose to overrule any past decisions if you still have concerns at the end of the assessment. To find out how the ProvePrivacy platform could help resolve your data challenges, get in touch or book your free demo today.